All right, folks, let's get started tonight talking about ethnography, one of my favorite subjects. Haha. Like this quote from the chapter from Ruth Behar, nothing is stranger than this business of humans observing other humans in order to write about them. And it is a strange business if you stop and think about it. We hope to be empowering the subjects that we research when we do social work research. But there's always this distance that you have from those that you researched. And I think that quote really grabs that. Now, when I think about ethnography, I often think about colonization. There was, during the 1890s, early 1900s up through 1930, especially during the Great Depression, there was ethnographers swarming all over Indian country here in the United States to capture what they thought was disappearing cultures. And when I think about ethnography, I also think about the exclusion of the female voice. And the two are not unrelated, because during those early years of ethnographic investigations, quite often it was almost exclusively men researchers researching societies that in many cases had taboos around contact between men and women. And that was coupled by a general patriarchal overemphasis on the male and the male structures. And quite often these ethnographers would not even grasp that many indigenous societies were matriarchal or matrilineal or had strong female roles in them, let alone actually take the time to interview these women when they could. Research is a knowledge construction process. That's what it is. No matter if you're doing qualitative research, whether you're doing statistical analysis, you're creating new knowledge from data. So whether that's about vanishing cultures or the lives of street people, the ethnography constructs that knowledge by observing the phenomenon of culture and people's lived experience in their natural environment. In the text, we read a little bit about a study done of mothering by women with serious mental illness, which is an interesting topic. And in this case, the researcher took a role as a worker in a child care center. So when we look at the rest of the chapter in whole, we can see where that kind of a study is going to include an insider-outsider perspective. Now there's a branch of ethnography called institutional ethnography, and really, you should consider that is what you are doing here in this study, is an institutional ethnography of the best practices in your area of study. A lot of ethnography is done through participant observation, and most of you are, or have been, or will be shadowing someone at your practicum. So use that time to consider your insider and outsider status. You're an insider to the institution because you're one of the intervention team, yet you're probably an outsider to the full intervention process, and you're certainly not an insider to the client and their world. Now, research, like so much other parts of the academy, have these technical terms, the emic perspective and the etic perspective, which is basically insider-outsider. In the book, in the chapter on ethnography, Sands talks about this role of the professional stranger, and that's a good way to think about yourself as you're going through your day-to-day observations of an institution when you're in researcher mode. And really, you can be in researcher mode all the time when you're at your practicum. Again, the subject of field notes comes up. I brought it up earlier in this semester. Sands brings it up in this chapter. Again, it's something to not take lightly. Here we see a set of field notes. Well, it's not field notes. It looks like some kid's homework, but it's a graphic that looks like a notebook. A good way to keep field notes is in a notebook. Remember that your field notes are just your observations. They're not necessarily the truth. Field notes is something that typically you fill out after an encounter that you find interesting. Nothing kind of puts the brakes on an interview than to have a little notebook that you're scribbling in all of the time. Now, interviews is another way of collecting data, and they're absolutely part of ethnographic investigations. It's deep into ethnographic methods, but they're never natural. They're just always a setup. So if you can find ways to make your interviews informal, work on those. Doing them in informal settings can help. Now, there's really just one exception that will be part of your best practices study, which is when you're interviewing your colleagues regarding professional issues or agency procedures or policies, those sorts of things. So it's real normal in a professional environment for somebody to sit down and talk with somebody about policies, procedures, etc. But when you're with your clients or when you're doing research with other vulnerable populations, the formal interview can skew the data that you collect because it's formal. They don't feel natural. They don't share as freely as you would like them to. And finally, there are other types of data, not just the android from Star Trek, but in the course of your investigation, you may pick up artifacts. Now, artifacts can be brochures. Artifacts can be posters that are on the wall. So take a picture of if your agency has a 7-step process to follow and it's plastered all over the place on posters, take a picture of that. That's one of your pieces of data that you can use in your study. There's also archived data. That's going to be your policy manuals, your procedure manuals, those sorts of things. And then there's observable phenomenon, and that is just as wide open as the name implies. It's anything that you can see, hear, feel, I suppose smell. So if you're doing a best practices investigation around post-traumatic stress disorder, for example, and you have a therapy session that you are lucky enough to observe, and you see that they're using the light bar from the EMDR, that's an observable phenomenon. The interactions of clients in the waiting room, observable phenomenon. The interaction of yourself and the client is again an observable phenomenon. So all this talk about ethnography serves one good point, for me anyway, is that is this week's participation points, is to go out and do some ethnographic observations. Be that professional stranger, as Sands talks about in the chapter this week. There will be written instructions on your wiki or journal or whatever it's called. So be looking for that.